Right, I shall bring you both back into, you don't have to address all those points, but if you'd like to come back on some of those points. Daniel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I'll talk a very little bit about my book, not because I'm trying to duck any of the questions, I'm going to try and answer them in my introduction, and not because I'm advertising it, because it's already been advertised. Jonathan clearly hasn't read it, because he's just got a straw man view of what it contains. Because what the book is about is not about no growth people. I make it very clear in the book that people who say there should be no growth are in a very small minority. The book is precisely about the idea that there are limits to growth, the idea of natural limits, social limits, moral limits, all these different limits to growth. And so inequality, for example, which you talked about, comes in relation to the social limits to growth. That's how I classify it. And I'm, in many respects, I would say that I am an egalitarian. I do want equality, but what I'm against is what I call green egalitarianism. In other words, the argument that inequality is used as an argument against growth. That's what I'm really against. So I want the poor people in the world to become rich. I want poor people in Britain to become rich. I don't want the kind of equality which means everyone is poor. I don't believe in levelling down. I want to make the whole society rich. So I very much do believe in a kind of positive growth-based equality, but I don't believe in using inequality as an argument against growth. I also think, I mean, you've got to do me a little bit of a favour, because I only had 8 minutes, so democracy, you know, obviously I couldn't talk about everything in 8 minutes, but I would argue that growth very much goes along with democracy. And in fact, when you look at authoritarianism, it's usually times of real authoritarianism, like during wars, where you have austerity and you have the denial of democracy. So I would argue very much they go together. My book is also, I would argue, very much in the left-wing tradition. I quote Sylvia Pankhurst, because traditionally, certainly until the 60s and 70s, it was the left that was really in favour of prosperity and growth. And I'm not going to talk about it now, but I've written an article which will be on my website next week, danielben-ami.com, where I argue that the Chicago school is not at all influential. I'm not a fan of the Chicago school, as it happens, but its influence is grossly exaggerated. It's really kind of marginal now, and I can go into great detail on that if you want. The article will be on my website. Finally, in relation to natural limits, this is not, despite the way that Jonathan portrayed it, my wacky idea. The idea that limits are there to be overcome originates with Francis Bacon, the founder of the scientific revolution, in the Renaissance period, during the period of Shakespeare, the Elizabethan period, and so on. And he argued then that an essential part of human progress and modernity was that human beings shouldn't shirk from what appeared to be natural limits. They should strive to overcome those limits. And that idea was central to modernity, and it has been absolutely central to human progress. It's only since the 70s that what is really a pre-modern idea, Jonathan's idea, which has become the orthodoxy now, that we should live in harmony with nature, a kind of medieval and before idea. It's only since then that it has become the orthodox view. And I would argue that that is a really negative view, because it means that we hold back from overcoming challenges. Even in relation to Jonathan's example of a field, yeah, of course you can exhaust the nutrients of the field, but if you cultivate the field, if you invest in the field, then it can become a lot more productive. In the 19th century, in fact, there was a debate about whether you could take Soho Square, which for those of you who don't know London is a small square in the centre of London. Could you feed the whole of London by cultivating Soho Square very intensively? Now, you know, obviously that's not possible now, I'm not suggesting it is, but even the fact that people were debating that is very interesting. That there was such, in the Victorian era, there was such a belief in human progress. People thought, yeah, in principle, we can make land so productive. We can produce so much that we could even take a small field in central London and we could feed the whole of Britain like that. It's that kind of attitude, overcoming the challenges, that we really need to cultivate, and what my book is really about.
Okay, Jonathan?
These are just fantasies, aren't they, really? I mean, that's the problem. I mean, I'm glad we've got to the point of distinguishing between saying on the one hand, there are no limits to growth, which is a very categorical statement, and saying on the other hand, that where those limits constrain economic progress for humankind, we can learn to base our economy within those limits. These are two compatible points of view, but if you start from the assumption there are no limits, I just don't know how you go on to talk about balanced growth within those limits. That does mean, in your terms, dealing with some of the constraining factors in those systems. Of course it does. but the starting premise is too difficult to deal with. Just on the issue about the social dimension, I mean, I think this has been a big running debate for the Green movement everywhere in the world for a very long time. And it is true that many of the founder organizations in the conservation movement in particular, so if you go back to the history of WWF and organizations like that, yes, it's perfectly true that historically you will find a rich thread of elitism running through those organizations. To be fair, that is now much less easy to find. And in fact, most green organizations today, particularly if you look at organizations like BTCV, Groundwork, doing stuff with real communities to improve people's lives and livelihoods, the social dimension is at least as clearly articulated, I would argue, as the environmental dimension. The Green Party that took a particular election campaign to the people in May this year was criticized yet again, and I remember this back in 1979, for having an election manifesto that was predominantly about socioeconomic issues and about equity and about finding different ways of creating prosperity for people. And a lot of journalists said, well, we can only find 2 pages on, quotes, the environment, quotes, in your manifesto. What kind of Green Party are you? And Caroline said, well, actually, you need to, Caroline. Lucas said, you need to understand the history of the Green Party has always been rooted in a commitment to social justice as well as a commitment to biophysical sustainability. That's an absolutely critical part of the history of green parties. It's fair to distinguish here because a lot of green NGOs in the early days were predominantly gearing their campaigns and their issues towards species, habitats, etc., etc. And they were certainly not mindful enough about the condition of the people who were living in those habitats at the time. So I think it's a fair point. I'm not sure that it's fair today. I think it's actually an evolving situation and one that we can look at very differently. The planet's going to go pop anyway, the man in the back said. I'm sort of a bit worried about that. I presume you mean after another 4.5 billion years. You mean that kind of pop. Yeah, okay, just checking. You're right. I mean, ultimately, there will be no life on this planet. You're absolutely right. The sun will eventually turn into a red dwarf or whatever it does, and at that point, you can guarantee nobody will be worrying themselves about sustainability. But the truth of it is, there's a long way to go between now and then. And the threat to our well-being, and I don't talk about the threat to our survival, incidentally, but the threat to our well-being is now so present because of accelerating climate change that we really can't ignore it. And if people continue to ignore it, then I'm sorry to say there will be a reckoning. Now that may not be language that you like, that may be why you describe yourself as an anti-environmentalist. But you tell me, is that a humanitarian position to take? Is that really in the best interest of the majority of people in the world today? Do you share Jim Lovelock's, quotes, climate optimism? By which he means, eventually things will pan out for humankind. And why? Because roughly 6 billion of us are going to die. That strikes me as a pretty bizarre, bordering on perverse form of optimism. And if the cost of getting to a sustainable world for the lucky 1 billion who hang on in refuges in the Arctic and the Antarctic, if the cost of that is the death of 5 and 6 billion people, that seems to me the epitome of inhumane callousness when it comes to the well-being of humankind. So I don't understand quite why you think an anti-environmentalist position is a more humane position than the position taken by environmentalists today, which is essentially about trying to get the best set of solutions for the largest number of people on the planet today in ways that don't screw it up for people tomorrow. That strikes me as the most humane position.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.